haute couture, hook hands, and BDSM. The 3 ingredients needed to write some of the most terrifying fanfiction ever to hit the internet. In 2001, a young woman wrote a series of obsessive blogs about her life goals: getting married, becoming a teacher, and suffering an accident that would cut off both her hands and disable her for life. And while many assumed that this was just creative writing, many more were deeply concerned that out there was a person being encouraged by the amputee fetish community to cut off her own hands. And just before her accident was set to occur, she completely disappeared. So what happened to her? Who are the people that get off to sexy amputation? And did she actually cut off her hands? This is the never-ending rabbit hole of Carol DBE. This is The Freaky Files. The year is 2000, and it was dark times ahead. A boy band called Limp Bizkit was sweeping the nation, and this was considered a triumph of graphic design. But for every Space Jam and Bonzi Buddy were hundreds of personal websites, and among them was one seemingly innocuous blog run by a woman called Carol DBE. And I'm warning you now, this is a handful. As she writes in her very first post, "Hi, my name is Carol, and I'm a 21-year-old college student studying to become a teacher of exceptional disabled children. I'm a high myope, and I wear glasses with thick plastic lenses. I'm also a bona fide DBE, double below elbow amputee wannabe. Yes, that means I really do want to have both of my hands and both of my wrists amputated about 8 inches below my elbows." And there was a deeply uneasy quality about her writing that immediately caught many people's attention. She explains, "Ever since I can remember, I've constantly dreamed and fantasized about becoming a real amputee myself, especially a real DBE amputee who wears twin body-powered prostheses with matching Dorrance No. 5X stainless steel hooks. Since I have previously thought that my obsession about becoming a real DBE amputee was unnatural, like coveting thy neighbor's husband, I always used to hide my feelings from everyone. I say used to because my whole life has now changed quite significantly. Just this past August, Rob, my fiancé, introduced me to his former girlfriend Debbie, a real DBE amputee who wears beautiful twin body-powered prostheses with Dorrance No. 5X stainless steel hooks. She and I quickly became very good friends, and I soon revealed to her my desire to become a real DBE amputee. And this goes on for 28 pages. At first, internet onlookers reached the conclusion many of you probably already have. This is just fetish fiction written by a guy into amputee college girls. Classic. That's why it's so repetitive and feels written without a human audience in mind. Clearly, this is just a sex thing, and no real human woman would sit down and write this. Only she did, because Carol was a real person with a very real obsession and some very real plans for May 5th of 2001. Debbie has always treated me as if I were her younger sister, and she's always been totally honest and very upfront about telling me absolutely everything I wanted to know concerning her tragic accident, the operations that were performed on her 2 arm stumps, and her return to living a very normal life using her twin stainless steel hooks in place of her 2 amputated hands. After Rob became my boyfriend, we would spend countless hours talking about how I could become a real DBE amputee like Debbie. We finally decided that I would have to suffer an accident. After 6 more nearly identical posts with titles like "I want hooks for hands just like Pam Westling" and "I want hooks for hands just like Blanche Shapiro," Carol reached a breaking point and decided that the only way she could ever feel complete was by suffering her own tragic accident. And luckily for her, her fiancé was not only incredibly supportive, but coincidentally had a history of dating DBE women. She writes, "I am indeed very well prepared to accomplish my new goal. I know just what to expect when I suffer the accident that causes me to become a real DBE amputee. I know just what to expect when I'm in the hospital to have surgery on my stumps. And I also know just what to expect when I finally have to wear twin body powered prostheses with Dorrance No. 5X stainless steel hooks." And it would be shortly following this post, after Carol announced that her accident was scheduled to line up with her birthday, graduation, and wedding to Rob, that she would completely abandon her blog. And if you're like the average reader, you must be feeling stumped. Because if this is real, how is it that Carol is surrounded by people who would encourage her to cut off her own hands? Or at the very least, didn't seem to mind. Well, luckily for us, it turns out that Carol actually wrote an additional 40,000 words about her amputation on a different website. But before we can figure out what actually happened to her, we should probably figure out how anyone gets this way to begin with. So off the bat, Carol DBE can only be one of three things: a bizarre fan fiction, a fetish, or a person with body identity integrity disorder. 1. So, as someone who was very recently a young woman, I simply cannot believe that this is just a fictional story written completely for fun. And in one of her few online correspondences, Carol admits that only some aspects of the story are fictional, so we can safely rule out a creative writing project. 2. The fetish. Part of what makes Carol's blog feel so incredibly fetishistic is just how overwhelming it is to read. Between the constant repetition and a visual style that can only be described as highly distressing, the writing barely feels like writing at all. And it may sound like a nitpick, but you have to remember that the early 2000s experienced a wave of charmingly ugly web design. Personalizing your web page with epic GIFs and fonts was just as important as filling it with content. And there's truly just something off-kilter about how spare Carol's blog is, especially for something designed by a young woman. It's just endless, raw, sensory input about how much this lady likes her hooks. It feels fetishy because it feels like it's addressed to an audience, but it appeals to no one. And even though Carol acknowledges that her fixation might be a little unusual, she has shockingly little insight into how strange this behavior actually is. And you know, it's a lot of these non-verbal cues that tell the bigger story. So fun fact, scent is actually a huge factor in non-verbal communication. For instance, the only reason anyone humors me in real life is because I smell really damn good. My latest obsession have been scents that are dark, fruity, and feminine, and my current favorite is Cherry Bomb by Confessions of a Rebel. It has notes of amber, juicy black cherry, and cherry liquor, and it dries down into a really seductive scent. I'm obsessed with this brand. I actually have several empties from them alone, and I found them through Scentbird. Scentbird is a monthly fragrance subscription service that lets you try out several generous samples a month from hundreds of designer and indie brands. It's super affordable. You get your first month for only $8 and your next month for $16.95. And just to show you how much you can save with Scentbird, this Cherry Bomb perfume smells exactly like a different fragrance I've been looking at that costs over $500. You can change your scent samples every month, get to experiment with tons of different vibes without breaking the bank, and even discover your signature scent. This month, I'm trying out a few fragrances that are pretty different from my usual. Dolce & Gabbana's Light Blue, a fresh citrusy summer scent, and Scentbird's original Strawberry Shortcake, a sweet, creamy scent that lasts forever. The packaging is stylish and super convenient. One vial contains way more than your average sample vial. Here's mine for comparison. And it's easy to take on the go. I love Scentbird. I've actually been using Scentbird for a couple years, and it was through them that I found one of my favorite fragrances ever. And if you're interested in trying Scentbird, use my code SCUMBAGOVICH or click the link below to get 55% off at Scentbird. You can get these amazing designer fragrances for half the price. That's just $8, and you can do it with my code. Thank you so much to Scentbird for kindly sponsoring this video, and on with the show. But for reasons we'll get into shortly, Carol probably doesn't have a fetish, but Rob almost certainly does. I mentioned before that Rob, in addition to supporting Carol's goals, is somewhat of a participant. In the world of amputee fetishism, Rob is what's known as a devotee. That is, someone who is aroused by an amputee but does not wish to become one. Carol, on the other hand, is a wannabe, which in fetish terms is self-explanatory. And it is probably no coincidence that she refers to her DBE desires with this exact vocabulary. Apotemnophilia, aka amputee fetish, has actually been documented since the late 1800s, with its first mainstream exposure in 1972 in Penthouse Mag, of all places, with readers sending in anonymous letters explaining their fetish. As with many more offbeat fetishes, it's usually male devotees of female subjects, but there's a lot of variation here. As one case study reads, a 48-year-old white female had been interested in men who had mobility impairments since she was a teenager. The first evidence of her interest was in high school, when she dated a boy who had a severe limp. Although they kissed, she reports not being very sexually aroused by him and was interested not in having intercourse, but in being with him and potentially seeing his affected leg. And you might be surprised at the sheer diversity of amputee gooners online. The usual suspects, DeviantArt, Fur Affinity, 4chan, this other website, contain at least several thousand images of limbless ladies apiece. Second Life, the OG predecessor to platforms like VRChat and the Metaverse, is home to a small but thriving amputee worship society. And in the real world, practitioners of this interest range from able-bodied people just role-playing in the privacy of their home to full-on 24/7 BDSM slave relationships in which amputees are subject to every whim of their master. Which brings us back to Rob. Rob has what's called acrotomophilia, meaning he is specifically turned on by the process and aftermath of other people's amputations. And while this is relatively harmless if kept in one's mind, it's difficult to read Carol's writings without getting the impression that she's a very vulnerable young woman being groomed into fetish behavior by her fiancé. For some of these people, it's a very slippery slope from obsessing over their partner losing a limb to engaging in roleplay to encouraging self-injurious behavior. And if you think this is a stretch, let's remember that Carol, for seemingly no reason, references her very poor eyesight and thick glasses. In fact, she does this repeatedly in all of her writing, because in addition to being a DBE wannabe, she's also what's known as a myo girl, a girl with severe myopia. So while researching this video, I actually stumbled upon the very obscure community of myo girl fetishists. A user named Jackbox, who will come up again, runs a Tumblr full of pictures of women with Coke bottle glasses, canes, and a range of disability aids. Visionandspecs.com, which at first just looks like a forum about glasses, is actually a digital myo girl goon cave. And in one particularly distressing case, user Specs Forever tells the story of a 15-year-old schoolgirl, allegedly, who hit him up for advice about making her friend's vision worse. The two of them engaged in a brief relationship, allegedly, in which he mailed her increasingly stronger lenses that she would secretly swap out for her friend to wear until her friend's vision deteriorated to this. There's a striking parallel between this and the relationship Rob seems to have with Carol, Debbie, and his previous paramours. The myopia, the double amputation, the subtext that Carol will probably have to rely on Rob for almost everything, including her ability to jork it, simply checks too many boxes. But there's a third, much more likely explanation for the mystery that is Carol DBE. But in order to explain that, let's finish Carol's story. The only thing scarier than Carol's writing style was her abrupt exit from the internet following her vow to cut off her hands. But the truth is, she didn't go anywhere, and though she abandoned her main blog for reasons unknown, she continued to obsessively chronicle her desires on a digital zine site called ananda.gloomchen.com. This site, which hosted a range of fictional stories, became Carol DBE's new focus. And on July 21st, 2001, Carol submitted this absolute chungus of a paragraph to the website. She wrote, "I just recently celebrated my 22nd birthday, my marriage, and my graduation from college. Although much more important than those three events is my ongoing celebration of my new life. My new life as a young woman who's not only extremely myopic, but who's also a real DBE amputee." It's worth noting that she places way more of an emphasis on her myopia in this submission than she has in the past. 4 years ago, I met Rob, who's now my husband. He has been a true woman arm amputee devotee, there's that word again, for as long as he can remember. It was Rob who explained to me that I was a true DBE woman amputee wannabe, that I wasn't abnormal in any way, and that I wasn't suffering from any kind of mental illness. This guy's a fucking predator. After Rob became my boyfriend, we would spend countless hours talking about how I could become a real DBE amputee like Debbie. We finally decided that I would have to suffer an accident that would result in the complete amputation of both of my hands just about 2 inches above both of my wrists. Rob and I both carefully and completely planned out my accident down to the very last detail, including how we would make absolutely sure that no doctor would be able to reattach either one or both of my hands after I'd amputated them. On Saturday, May 5th, 2001, the day that Rob and I had specifically selected for my accident, at long last arrived. I met Rob at his apartment and I was wearing a pair of good jeans along with a new white short sleeve sweatshirt because I was going to help Rob with some work that he was doing. I cannot and I do not want to go into the details of the work we did that day because I don't want anyone to even think about doing what I actually did. All I'll say is that during the course of our work, Rob had to temporarily leave me alone while he went to get a few things that we needed. During the several minutes that he was gone, I suffered a very tragic accident. I not only completely severed both of my hands about 1 inch above both of my wrists, but I also completely mangled what little remained of my 2 amputated hands. As I screamed for help, I could sense that my entire body was going into shock. When he heard my screams, Rob rushed back to me, and when he saw the totally handless stumps of my 2 arms, he then realized what I'd already realized. I'd actually succeeded in finally becoming a real DBE amputee. From here, Carol describes her family's utter devastation, her struggles post-accident, and her absolute joy at having gotten rid of her hands at long last. Though she disclaims at the very end that she would never recommend anybody do this, nor does she want anyone to suffer as a consequence of her decision, she maintains that this was her happily ever after. But it seems, thankfully, that the amputation story was the fictional half of her kinda fictional writing. The editor of the website affirms that although this is one of the weirder submissions that he's ever gotten, it's merely a fictional account of Carol's future plans. Which is to say, her hands are fine. And though we'll cover the present day in just a minute, this brings us to the third and most likely explanation for this entire thing. 3. Body Identity Integrity Disorder, also known as BIID. Though controversial and very poorly understood, BIID is a mismatch between one's mental body map versus what's actually there. This extremely rare pathology is thought to be present from birth. Sufferers of this condition experience a sense of over-completion. Something about their body is foreign or excessive to them and they simply cannot go on until it is removed. And as you can probably surmise, this carries a very high risk of fucking around and finding out. In one of the most famous BIID cases on the internet, Kelly Ronahan, also known online as Differentially Kelly, suffered some combination of BIID and Munchausen syndrome. Though otherwise physically healthy, she was consumed by a need to be sick and attended to constantly. She systematically created and infected all sorts of wounds on her legs until the damage became so severe doctors were forced to amputate. And much more infamously, in 2015, a woman named Jewel Shooping went public with her BIID story. Convinced that she was meant to live as a blind person, Jewel could not be persuaded of the danger of her condition and took matters into her own hands when she poured drain cleaner directly into her eyes, which is what most of you probably do when you watch my videos. She was permanently blinded.
BIID means that you have a need to be disabled in some way. In my case, it was a need to go blind. I found that drain cleaner is a little less painful, although it does a lot of damage to the eye. Because drain cleaner was easily available to me, I went with that.
And though people with BIID claim that their removal or destruction of the affected body part really does improve their lives in the long term, this is obviously not the case. For more on this particular angle, by the way, I would absolutely recommend the Internet Investigator or Darby Valentine's videos on Carol DBE. And I suspect that Carol probably has something similar to this, because as she writes in the post-amputation part of her story, almost immediately I felt as though a tremendously heavy weight had finally been lifted off of my shoulders, because I honestly felt relieved that all my years of waiting were at last over. I also felt an overwhelming sensation of joy, because I realized I would finally be spending the rest of my life as a real DBE amputee, who would wear beautiful twin body-powered prostheses with Dorrance No. 5X stainless steel hooks. And I truly believe that at the heart of Carol's predicament is the fact that not only did she experience a real sense of alienation, maybe not from her hands, but certainly from some part of her body, but that she was also being very intentionally pushed in a certain direction by a guy with a fetish. And knowing all of this, who is Carol DBE? In perhaps the greatest twist of this entire ordeal, Reddit actually did something pretty based. In 2019, a post in the non-murder mystery subreddit renewed interest in Carol and her real identity. After weeks of cross-referencing social media posts, user Snails for Speedy managed to track Carol down on Facebook. And you'll be glad to hear that she not only separated from Rob, but appears to be happily married and leading a very ordinary life. And in a bit of a weird coincidence, one Reddit detective identified a Rob Kassler as referenced in Carol's posts, though I highly doubt this is the same guy. Rob Kassler and Jack Cast not only vaguely share a name, but are also devotees of the exceedingly rare Mayo Girl and Amputee Fetish combo, so make of that what you will. Carol DBE's presence in the early 2000s internet, though fleeting and anomalous, created one of the most enduring and fascinating rabbit holes we have to date. And this could have been a much longer video had I read more of her blog or dug into the dozens of fetishes that her writing, intentionally or not, absolutely catered to. But with a case like this, truly, the more you seek, the more you'll find. And I think it's about time I let you off the hook. This has been The Freaky Files. Thanks again to Scentbird for kindly sponsoring today's video. Use my code SCUMBAGOVICH or click the link below to get 55% off at Scentbird. That's code SCUMBAGOVICH for 55% off your first month.